The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and the particular kind of silence that fills a space when people are deciding whether you still matter to them. My daughter, Diane, stood at the foot of my bed with her arms folded across her chest. She hadn't come close enough to touch me. She stood at the far end, like I was something she didn't want to catch. My son, Kevin, was by the window. He was looking out at the parking lot below, his back mostly turned toward me, like whatever was happening out there on that gray asphalt was far more interesting than his father lying in a hospital bed with wires on his chest. The doctor came in and asked, in his routine professional way, who would be signing my discharge papers. Diane picked up her bag from the chair. "Not us," she said. Her voice was flat. Decided. Like she had already rehearsed this part. He didn't care about us when he had money. Let him figure it out. She walked out first. Kevin followed without turning around. Without a word. Without a single backward glance. The heart monitor started beeping faster. I lay there and realized, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that they were not coming back. The beeping slowed eventually. A nurse adjusted something on my fore without making eye contact. I think she had heard what Diane said. People always hear more than they let on. About an hour after my children walked out, I reached for my phone on the bedside tray. My hands felt heavier than they should have. There was a group text waiting for me. Diane had sent it to Kevin and several family members I recognized, cousins, her aunt, people from her mother's side who had never particularly liked me. The message was short. Dad always chose money over us. Karma's real. At the end, she had added a laughing emoji. They hadn't just walked out. They had announced it. They had turned my worst moment into something to share and collect reactions on, like it was entertainment. And here is the part that surprised me most. For the first time in my entire life, 67 years of defending my choices, justifying my decisions, explaining myself to anyone who questioned me, I said absolutely nothing in response. Not a single word. I set the phone back down and stared at the ceiling tiles. Something had shifted in me in that hospital room, something quiet and permanent. And I was going to let it. My name is Richard. I am 67 years old, and I built a construction company from nothing. I grew up in a small house with 4 siblings and parents who worked themselves into the ground without ever quite making ends meet. I swore, early and with total conviction, that my children would never live like that. That money would never be the problem in my family the way it had been in mine. So I worked in a way most people simply don't. 14-hour days were normal. 16-hour days happened often. I missed birthdays, not all of them, but enough. I missed school plays. I missed anniversaries. I told myself I was doing it for them, and I believed that completely. When their mother, Patricia, died 12 years ago from a sudden stroke, I didn't know how to grieve. I only knew one thing: how to work. So I buried myself in projects and timelines and contracts while my children, 17 and 19 years old, needed a father who could sit still and feel something alongside them. I couldn't do it. I didn't know how. They never forgave me for that. And somewhere underneath everything, I'm not certain I ever fully forgave myself either. When the money was flowing steadily, my children stayed close. Holiday dinners happened at my house every year without fail. The table was always full. Diane would bring friends sometimes. Kevin would arrive late and loud, in the kind of good humor that only exists when a person feels comfortable and provided for. They called when tuition was due. They called when car payments became difficult. The requests were never aggressive. They were warm, actually, affectionate in the way children can be when they need something and know it will be given. I paid every time, without complaint and without conditions. But when I asked them to come over on a regular Sunday just to sit and talk, they were busy. Always something: a prior commitment, a friend's event, a trip. Kevin would say he'd try and then not show. Diane would send an apology the morning of that felt rehearsed. I noticed all of it. I kept a quiet record in the back of my mind, the way older men do when they've spent decades reading people and contracts, and the way things are actually going beneath the surface of what people choose to say. I just didn't say anything. Not yet. About 2 years before the hospital, I made what I thought was a meaningful decision. I transferred partial ownership of the company to Kevin. He was 34 at the time. He had worked in the business sporadically, summers during college, a few stretches in his late 20s, but never consistently. Still, I thought a formal stake might give him something to attach himself to. A reason to show up and stay. He said he wanted to learn the business from the inside. He used words like legacy and continuity, and I was moved by them in the way a father is moved when his son seems to finally want what the father has spent a lifetime building. Within 4 months, I started noticing things. Expenses were climbing in places they never had. Office lease upgrades. New vehicles on the company fleet that nobody had authorized. Hires I hadn't approved for roles I couldn't define. When I sat down with Kevin and asked him to walk me through the numbers, he waved his hand in that easy, dismissive way he had. "You're old-fashioned, Dad. The business needs to look a certain way to attract the right clients." I didn't argue. But I started making copies of everything. Then the market shifted. Construction is sensitive to interest rates and economic uncertainty in ways other industries aren't. Projects that had been moving forward started stalling. 2 contracts I had counted on to anchor the year fell through in the same month. Cash flow tightened in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. And almost immediately, like a change in weather, my children stopped visiting altogether. I don't mean they visited less. I mean they stopped entirely. Diane's occasional check-in calls went silent. Kevin, who was now a partial owner, became difficult to reach even for business matters. One evening I called Diane and mentioned I was considering selling a smaller commercial property to stabilize the company's cash position. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Maybe you should have thought about family instead of buildings all those years." She said it lightly, almost casually. But I held on to that sentence. I wrote it down in the small notebook I kept in my desk drawer, the one where I had been recording other observations. That sentence told me precisely where we stood. It was not the sentence of someone who was hurt. It was the sentence of someone who had been watching and waiting. 6 months before the hospital, I was walking a job site in the early morning, just a routine inspection, when the pain started. It began in my shoulder. Then it moved across my chest in a way that felt different from anything I had experienced before. Not sharp. More like pressure. Something sitting on me that I couldn't shift. I sat down on a concrete block. One of my site managers, a young man named Aaron who had been with me 4 years, saw my face and called an ambulance without hesitation. The doctors told me later that if Aaron hadn't acted as quickly as he did, the outcome could have been very different. Minor heart attack. That is what they called it. Diane and Kevin visited the hospital once, for about 40 minutes. Diane checked her watch 3 times while I was talking. Kevin waited for a pause in conversation, then asked, casually, whether I had given any more thought to updating my formal ownership documentation. I was in a hospital bed. There were still electrodes on my chest. That was the moment I stopped pretending I didn't know what was happening. They were not waiting for me to get better. They were waiting for me to be finished. I was still recovering in the hospital when I asked my lawyer, Frank, to come see me. I told the nurses I was having a legal consultation. Frank arrived with his briefcase and the careful, unhurried expression I had trusted for over 20 years. I didn't tell him everything that first meeting. I just asked questions. What would happen if I chose to restructure the company entirely from the top down? What legal tools existed to reverse a partial ownership transfer if mismanagement could be demonstrated? What protections did I have as the original founder if I moved assets into a formal trust before any outside legal action could be initiated? Frank listened without interrupting. Then he set his pen down and looked at me for a long moment. "Richard," he said, "are you sure you want to know the answers to all of these?" I told him I had never been more certain of anything in my adult life. He opened his briefcase and took out a yellow legal pad. We talked for 2 hours. I left that conversation with a plan I hadn't fully had before, and something else I hadn't felt in months. Calm. Real calm, not the managed kind. 2 weeks after that first hospitalization, I had the second one. The one where Diane said, "Not us," and Kevin stood at the window and they both walked out without a word. A nurse named Vera helped me arrange a car service home. She was professional and kind and did not comment on the fact that no family member had come to collect me. I was grateful for that more than I could have explained. The drive home took 40 minutes. I watched the city move past the window the whole way. When I arrived, I went directly to my office the way I always did, out of decades of unbroken habit. The safe in the corner, the one I had installed 18 years earlier to hold the company's emergency documents, property deeds, and a cash reserve for urgent operational needs, was open. It had been opened with the combination. Not forced. Not broken into. It was completely empty. I stood in front of it for a long moment. I didn't break anything or raise my voice. I was too tired for drama, and I had already suspected something like this was coming. I turned around, sat in my desk chair, and picked up my phone to call Frank. He answered on the second ring. Frank had already begun pulling company records on my earlier instruction. What he walked me through over 2 evenings at my kitchen table was worse than I had fully anticipated. Kevin had authorized a series of large withdrawals from company operational accounts in the 3 weeks before my second hospitalization. The authorizations were technically within his partial ownership rights, but the amounts were far outside anything discussed or budgeted, with no accompanying documentation. Diane's name appeared on a property transfer request for one of my smaller commercial holdings, filed quietly through a secondary legal channel, using an attorney I had never heard of and had certainly never retained. I sat with all of this for a full night before responding to any of it. They hadn't simply drifted away. They had been actively maneuvering during my physical vulnerability, using the window of my recovery to move things out of my control and into theirs. The patience they had never shown me as a father, they had apparently been saving entirely for this. I thought about that for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and called them both and asked them to come to the house. They came, which surprised me slightly. I had half expected them to find a reason not to. They arrived together on a Thursday evening, Kevin first, Diane 2 minutes behind, and they sat across from me in the living room with the particular confidence of people who believe they have already won and are simply waiting for the formalities to catch up. I asked Kevin, quietly, to explain the withdrawals. He didn't deny them. He didn't hesitate even slightly. "We're protecting what's going to be ours anyway," he said simply. "It was coming to us eventually. We were making sure it didn't get complicated." Diane nodded. "You owe us," she said. "For everything we missed. For everything you weren't there for." She said it like a verdict that had already been handed down and filed. I looked at both of them for a long moment. I thought about Patricia. I thought about the job site where I had collapsed with electrodes on my chest. I thought about the empty safe. Then I said, "Thank you for being honest." I meant it genuinely. Dishonest people don't let you know exactly where you stand. These two had just handed me the clearest picture I had ever had. And I intended to use it. The morning after that meeting, I called Frank before 7 o'clock. We put the first actions into motion that same day. Kevin's partial ownership structure included provisions I had insisted on including when the transfer was drafted 2 years earlier, provisions allowing me to withdraw operational control if performance benchmarks were not met or if mismanagement could be demonstrated. Frank had identified that pathway in the hospital. The authorization for discretionary withdrawals was suspended immediately. Transfer requests connected to my accounts were flagged for mandatory review. By mid-afternoon, Kevin's access to the company's operational systems had been cleanly shut down. The change in tone was immediate. Kevin called me at 6 that evening. The easy confidence from the night before was completely gone. His voice was tight. He said I was overreacting. He said the situation had been misunderstood. He said I should slow down before creating problems for everyone. Diane sent a message saying she was hurt and shocked. The word shocked stayed with me. They had genuinely believed I had no available options. That quiet certainty, that absolute confidence that I was trapped and powerless, that had been the foundation of their entire plan. It was also their biggest mistake. Frank called me on a Tuesday with something he had uncovered during his review of company communications. He had found an email thread routed through the business server, which I had full administrative access to as original owner. The thread went back 4 months. Kevin and Diane had been corresponding with a third-party asset acquisition firm about the potential sale of several company holdings. The emails were detailed. There were draft terms, valuation discussions, and a projected timeline for when transfers could realistically be completed without triggering immediate legal review. That timeline corresponded almost exactly with the period when I had been at my most physically depleted, recovering from the first heart attack, managing reduced energy, seeing fewer people. They hadn't been planning to run the business. They had been planning to sell it off in pieces to a third party and take the proceeds. 22 years of work. Projects across 6 states. A company name I had built from a single truck and a 2-person crew. Frank delivered all of this calmly, the way he delivered everything. But when he finished, he was careful about how he looked at me. He was giving me a moment. I took it. Frank and I worked for 10 days on the restructure. I want to be honest that I wasn't trying to punish them. What I was doing was something I should have done years earlier, building a structure around the company that reflected what it had actually cost to build and what it actually deserved to become. I transferred the company into a formal trust with a new oversight board. The board included Frank, a retired business attorney named Clifford who had been a colleague for 15 years, and Aaron, the site manager who had called the ambulance the morning I collapsed. Aaron had been with me 4 years and had never once given me a reason to question his judgment. Kevin's shares were restructured from direct ownership to performance-based participation, tied strictly to demonstrable contribution and subject to board approval, carrying no automatic access or independent value. Diane's shares received the same treatment. The property transfer request she had filed through the outside attorney was formally withdrawn and flagged in the legal record. When Frank presented the completed documents, I read every page carefully. Then I signed them slowly. For the first time in months, I felt like myself. Kevin had been counting on something specific without my knowledge. He had been in discussions with a lender about using his company's shares as partial collateral for a personal loan, a substantial one, from what Frank could determine. The loan was meant to cover personal debts Kevin had accumulated, including expenses connected to the luxury spending he had run through company accounts. When the bank moved to process the application, they discovered that Kevin's shares had been reclassified. They no longer carried independent monetary value outside the trust framework. They could not legally be used as loan collateral without board approval, approval Kevin would need to formally request and justify. The loan was denied. Kevin called me that evening. He was not calm. His voice had a high, strained quality I had never heard from him, not even when he was a teenager and things had gone badly. He said the bank had made an error. He said I had given them wrong information. He said there would be serious damage to his credit and I needed to call and correct things immediately. He spoke for nearly 4 minutes without stopping. I listened to all of it. Then I set the phone carefully on my desk without responding. The auditors Frank brought in to review the period of Kevin's operational control took 3 weeks to complete their work. The report ran 41 pages. The luxury expenses Kevin had run through company accounts were itemized fully. Fleet vehicles with no operational justification. A commercial suite lease that served no company function. A consulting fee paid repeatedly to an LLC registered in Kevin's wife's name. Catering charges and electronics purchases that were never tied to any project. Diane's involvement had its own dedicated section. She had been issuing invoices to the company through a personal business account, invoices for work that, when Frank's team reviewed internal communications thoroughly, did not correspond to any actual service delivered. The amounts were not enormous individually, but over 14 months they added up to something very significant. Both Kevin and Diane were required, under the original ownership agreements they had each signed, to repay funds drawn under demonstrably improper circumstances. Repayment was a legal obligation attached to documents they had apparently never read with much care. Kevin's call that evening sounded different from the lone call. Quieter. The high, strained quality was gone. He just sounded tired. I understood that feeling very well. I hadn't spoken to most of my extended family in years. That had happened gradually, the way many things do, not through any single decision but through accumulated missed occasions and unreturned calls. After the audit results became part of the legal record, information moved through the family the way it always does. Frank had been careful about confidentiality, but these things find their path. Patricia's sister, Audrey, called me one afternoon. She said she had heard things were difficult. She asked plainly how I was really doing. I told her the truth. All of it. Not to manage her perception, but because she asked and I was tired of carrying everything silently. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Richard, we always knew they were taking advantage. We just didn't think it was our place to say." Within 2 weeks, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years were calling. Old friends from the early business days reached out. People who had heard the version of events where I was simply the cold father getting what he deserved were now hearing the fuller picture. Kevin's and Diane's phones, from what Audrey later told me, had gone noticeably quiet. Frank arranged a formal meeting in his conference room on a Friday afternoon. Kevin and Diane arrived with their own attorney, a man named Bryce who had a good suit and an expression suggesting he was used to walking into rooms with more leverage than he had today. They expected negotiation. They had the posture of people who expected to bargain their way to a comfortable middle ground. Frank opened by laying the documentation on the table. Not summarizing it. Laying it out physically, page by page, in organized sections. The withdrawals. The property transfer attempt. The email thread with the acquisition firm. The audit report. The inflated consulting invoices. All of it. I didn't speak much. I had said what needed saying on that Thursday evening in my living room. This meeting wasn't about words. It was about paper. Diane began crying partway through. Something quieter and harder to define than anger, like she was finally grasping something she had been able to avoid until this moment. Kevin argued in a whispered exchange with Bryce that I wasn't meant to hear but did. When we adjourned, Bryce requested 2 weeks to review everything. Frank said that was fine. While the legal process moved forward, I made a decision about the company's future that I had actually been considering for longer than anyone knew. I announced my retirement. I was 67 years old. I had survived 2 heart attacks inside 6 months. I had spent nearly 4 decades building something I was genuinely proud of. It was time. But the retirement announcement came with a specific plan, and that plan was the part that surprised people. I had spent 20 years watching the men and women who actually ran my job sites. The project managers, the senior crew leads, the people who arrived every single morning regardless of weather or difficulty and did the real work that made everything possible. Aaron was one. There were 7 others I had identified across the years. The company would transition to employee ownership. These 8 individuals, chosen based on verified tenure and contribution, would hold real equity with actual rights. Kevin's and Diane's restructured shares remained in the new structure, but they represented a small and non-controlling portion of the whole. Any meaningful role going forward would require demonstrated performance and board approval. Kevin stared at the announcement document for a long time. Then he looked at Diane. Neither of them said a word. The repayment terms were formalized in a settlement that Bryce and Frank negotiated over 3 meetings. Kevin would repay the full amount identified in the audit as improperly drawn from company accounts, including the payments made to the LLC in his wife's name. The total came to just under $90,000, structured in quarterly installments over 4 years. Diane would repay the inflated consulting invoices in full. Her total was lower, just under $30,000, with a similarly strict installment schedule. The property transfer request she had filed through the outside attorney was formally dissolved. The property was returned to the trust. The asset acquisition firm received a legal notice that the company was not available for sale and that the individuals they had been communicating with had lacked the authority to initiate those conversations. I sat in Frank's office when the final paperwork was signed. I didn't feel triumph. Not in any sharp, satisfying sense. I felt something closer to completion. Like a very long project had reached its final stage. The early inheritance they had been quietly assembling for themselves was gone. What remained was a legal obligation, a repayment schedule, and a future shaped entirely by choices they had already made. 3 months after the settlement, I sold the house. Not because I needed the money. The trust was structured soundly and the company was generating steady revenue under Aaron's management. I sold it because I wanted to. It was a large house. 6 bedrooms. A formal dining room I had eaten in perhaps a dozen times in 20 years. A backyard maintained by a landscaping crew because I was never home enough to maintain it myself. It had always been more symbol than home, a marker of how far I had come from the small house with 4 siblings and exhausted parents. I didn't need the symbol anymore. I bought a smaller property on the edge of a lake, 40 minutes outside the city. 3 bedrooms. A porch facing the water. Enough land for quiet. The morning I moved in, I stood on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the light move across the lake for almost an hour without thinking about anything in particular. I hadn't done that in decades. Just stood somewhere and looked without calculating what needed to happen next. It felt strange at first. Then it felt like something I hadn't known I was missing. Peace, I was learning at 67, feels better than control. Aaron introduced me to a young contractor named Philip about 2 months after I settled into the lake house. Philip was 26, sharp and hungry in the way I recognized from my own early years, and he was struggling with business fundamentals nobody had taught him: bidding, contracts, managing client relationships, cash flow. He was good with his hands and good with people, but the business side was going to bury him if he didn't get a handle on it. I started meeting with him once a week. Word spread the way it does in trade communities, and 2 more young contractors reached out. Then a 4th. I wasn't charging anything. I wasn't building a consulting practice. I simply had things to say that were useful, and saying them to people genuinely trying to build something felt more meaningful than most of what I had done with my time in the previous decade. I started accepting invitations to speak at local business association events, small ones, informal. I reconnected with old colleagues I had lost track of during the years when the business consumed everything. I was present in a way I had never been when there was a company to run and children asking me for money. It turned out being present felt like something real. I didn't follow Kevin's and Diane's situations closely. I wasn't tracking them or taking any satisfaction in difficulty finding them. But Audrey kept me loosely informed because she cared about all of us, and she felt I deserved to know when things were significant. Kevin's personal finances had contracted sharply with the quarterly repayment obligations now in place. The lifestyle he had built, the kind that always required more income than he was actually generating himself, was not sustainable on what he earned independently. He had taken a management role at a mid-sized firm. A reasonable job, but a different life from the one he had been running at my expense. Diane had closed the personal business account she had used for the inflated invoices. Her lifestyle had contracted too. Audrey mentioned hearing them argue at a family gathering, each apparently finding ways to assign responsibility to the other for decisions they had made together. People were noticing. That was simply the nature of things. There was no dramatic cruelty on my part. I hadn't done anything to damage them beyond removing the structure that had allowed them to draw from me without consequence. Reality, once it arrived, was doing everything that needed doing on its own. About 8 months after moving into the lake house, Diane came to see me. She came alone. She drove the 40 minutes without calling ahead. I saw her car come up the gravel path from the kitchen window and felt my chest tighten, not from fear, but from something more complicated. I opened the door before she could knock. She looked tired. Not dramatically so. But something around her eyes was different from how I remembered. Softer. Less defended. I made coffee. We sat on the porch and watched the lake without either of us speaking. The silence wasn't hostile. It was more like 2 people figuring out where to begin. Then she said, quietly, almost to herself, We thought you didn't love us. I didn't rush to correct her. I let it sit for a moment the way it deserved. Then I said, I didn't know how to show it. That's not the same as not feeling it. But I understand why it felt the same from where you were standing. She didn't answer right away. We stayed on that porch for 2 hours. No accusations. No legal language. Just a father and daughter speaking honestly, perhaps for the first real time in years. It wasn't resolution. But it was a beginning. And that felt like enough. I've had time to think about what all of this actually was. What happened didn't begin in that hospital room. It didn't begin with the audit or the empty safe. Those were just the late stages of something built over a very long time. It began with absence. I gave my children everything I believed mattered: security, money, opportunity. What I didn't give them was a father who could sit in a room and be present. Who could grieve alongside them when their mother died. Who could put down the work and know them. I gave them wealth and withheld presence. When you do that to people you love, you teach them, without meaning to, that love and transaction are the same thing. They learned it from watching me. That was the hardest truth to hold. When they tried to treat me like an asset to be sold, they were doing what they had learned. And when I stopped acting like one, when I stopped allowing myself to be drawn from without consequence, that was the first honest thing I had done as their father in years. Success without connection is empty. Self-respect without guilt is freedom. And sometimes the strongest thing a parent can do is stop paying for what they failed to give.